Alright, so before we truly begin, I just want to thank each and every one of you for coming out today to listen to what I have to say. And I would, of course, like to thank any past or current members of the armed forces for serving our country. So, without further ado, I'm going to go over a couple of ground rules. I'm sure you all know I'm talking about a few military veterans and heroes from the Erie area. However, we will not be talking about Oliver Hazard Perry or Strong Vincent, as their stories are kind of the most widespread. And without further ado, first I have to go over a couple of points about the U.S. Civil War. So, the U.S. Civil War truly starts when the Confederates opened fire on Fort Sumter. Lincoln, who was president at the time, had told the Union that he will not fire the first shots, but he is intent on holding onto all federal property that is still in the South, including places like Fort Sumter. So when the Confederates fired on it, they kind of gave him the opening to declare war on the CSA. So the U.S. Army, pre-Civil War, had about 16,000 men. That's it. And you have to remember that we had a lot of those guys out on the frontiers fighting Native Americans, and a good number of those men would have also gone and supported the South. However, by the end of the Civil War, the Union strength is at 1 million men. So there are a couple ways that we ballooned from less than 16,000 men to a whopping million. Some of it was, of course, later in the war we started to enact a draft, but throughout the beginning and middle part of the war, you had a lot of ecstatic volunteers kind of get together, form their own bands and their own regiments at a local level. And so, I'm not going to be talking about one such individual who served in the Civil War. Instead, we are going to be talking about the 83rd Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment. The 83rd was made up mostly of volunteers from Erie and other such parts of northwest Pennsylvania, one notable member, and the commander of the regiment being Strong Vincent, so I have to break that rule just a little bit to talk about the rest of these guys. The 83rd was involved in a lot of the major battles along the eastern region of the U.S. of the Army of the Potomac, seeing action at Antietam, at Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, and of course at Gettysburg. Notably, at Gettysburg, we stood right next to the 20th Maine on Little Round Top, which is where Strong Vincent was hit and later died of his wounds. The reason I talk about this regiment as a whole, however, is because when it comes to the Civil War, our regiment is noted as having suffered the second most battle-related casualties. One big element of the Civil War is that more men died of disease than on the fields of battle. So for the 83rd to be noted as having suffered one of the highest amount of casualties from battle shows that we've quite literally bled for the Union. And as you see here, by the end of the war, this is what our regiment's battle flag looked like, all ripped up, torn to shreds from years and years of the fighting. Well, no one in the 83rd was decorated with awards such as the Medal of Honor during the Civil War. One veteran of the 83rd, Leander Herring, did earn the Medal of Honor fighting the Native Americans some years later. However, he is kind of claimed by Nebraska as their first Medal of Honor recipient, as he settled there after his service in the U.S. Army came to a close. But I still felt that it was worth noting here because I imagine he picked up a lot of those skills fighting alongside with the Erie boys. If anyone's wondering about this photograph right here as well, this is supposedly what the regiment's uniform looked like. You saw a lot of regiments kind of take on a unique look during the early days of the Civil War, but as the war kind of dragged on and logistics became a bit more standardized, you would see a lot of these unique things like the headgear, shoulder spear replaced by your normal issue caps and what have you. So we're going to jump good 30 years ahead now, talk about the next major conflict that the United States got itself involved in. the Spanish-American War. Now, I'm sure a lot of you in this room have a vague notion of Remember the Maine and kind of some idea of why we got involved with Spain in the West Indies and in around Asia. Well, the Spanish Empire had been waning for pretty much the duration of the 1800s, and they were just trying to keep a tight grip on what possessions they had left. So by the late 1890s, when a bunch of Cubans are seeking their independence once again, the Spanish try to tighten their grip, and there are quite a few atrocities that took place between the Spaniards and the Cubans. Of course, the U.S. press is heavily involved here. They exaggerated some of the events in order to sell newspapers. This is often referred to as yellow journalism. So, after all these exaggerated reports about what the Spaniards are doing to the Cubans start to get back to the U.S., the public gets quite frustrated. Being as our country started by gaining independence from our colonial overlords, the British, a lot of people in the U.S., they feel for the Cubans. The tipping point is when the Maine explodes outside of the coast of Havana and sinks to the bottom of the sea. No one was quite sure why the Maine sunk. Today we think that a boiler just kind of exploded and the whole ship just went down because of that. But seeing the tensions that were brewing in the U.S. at this time over the Cuban War of Independence, the U.S. public explodes. With the help of yellow journalism, Spain is blamed, and Americans all over our country cry, remember the Maine, as a bunch of volunteers are signing up to go and show Spain what for. And so on April 25th, 1898, the U.S. Declares war on Spain, mostly due to this public outrage. Thanks, William Randolph, first. So besides our actions against the Spanish in the West Indies, Cuba, Puerto Rico, all that, we also target a lot of their possessions in the Pacific, Guam, but more importantly than Guam, the Philippines. And so we're going to talk about one such Erieite who was heavily involved in the Battle of Manila Bay for the Philippines. That man being Charles Vernon Gridley. Now you'll probably notice that he wasn't born in Erie. He was born in Logansport, Indiana, 1844. So why is he in this presentation? Well, after serving in the U.S. Navy during the Civil War and fighting at the Battle of Mobile Bay, he stays in the Navy and his career continues. He ends up finding himself stationed in Erie with the USS Michigan. And like a lot of sailors, he marries a local Erie woman and kind of makes Erie his permanent residence. Fun fact, he actually married a relative of Straub Vincent, kind of marrying into that family. So there is a connection between those two men. Very loose one, albeit. But despite putting his roots in Erie, he's still a Navy man. So in early 1898, he finds himself in charge of the USS Olympia, the flagship of Commodore George Dewey. Now, Dewey's fleet was sent out to the Pacific to make trouble for the Spanish after war had been declared on them. And the fleet sails around Manila, and there's a huge disparity between the U.S. and the Spanish forces on this island. The battle opens up with some famous words from George Dewey to Gridley, saying, "You may fire when ready, Gridley," thereby immortalizing this man in the events at Manila Bay. And as as his buddy, Gridley, fires the opening shots, the rest of the fleet opens up as well. I would dare say that Battle of Manila Bay is probably one of the most one-sided victories in this country's history. Following the Spanish defeat, you land a bunch of Marines on the country, take it over, and while the local Filipinos don't take too kindly to that, and we have quite a bit of troubles with them in the years to come, Gridley doesn't quite make it that far. He doesn't quite live long enough to celebrate his accomplished victory. the tropical conditions of the Pacific were not too kind to him. He took ill rather quickly following his victory, and he was on his way back to the United States to rest and recuperate, where he was on his way back and he passed away that same year. A lot of you have probably heard of Gridley Park. So it should come as no surprise that it is this man for whom that park is named. But in addition to Gridley Park, the U.S. Navy has named 4 ships after Gridley in honor of his service at the Battle of Manila Bay. So we have to go ahead another 20 years to another conflict that the U.S. only really got into because of public outrage. That is the First World War. Now, whilst the conflict began in 1914, the U.S. had managed to stay neutral until 1917. I think having an ocean between us and the rest of Europe has some effect on that, quite a bit of an effect on that. But there are a few things that, over time, gradually pulled us into the war. So, Germany, by this point in history, has submarines, U-boats, and so in an effort to starve the British out, they enact unrestricted submarine warfare. They tell the entire planet, including neutral countries, if your boats go anywhere in this part of the Atlantic, kind of around Britain and France, we are liable to sink them. Because if they could stop Britain from being fed, they could pull Britain out of the war, France becomes easier to deal with, so on and so forth. And so, one of the ships the Germans take out is the Lusitania, a British ship, I believe, but it had a lot of American passengers on it. And so, when the Germans took it out, a lot of American citizens died, and a lot of people back here in the States were quite angry. Now, no one knew that the Lusitania also contained a lot of supplies for the British Army, notably a lot of ammunition. And so one could argue that the American citizens on board that ship were unfortunately, I suppose, human shields, kind of a deterrence to stop the Germans from taking out the ship. However, that unfortunately did not work. So the U.S. is already pretty mad about the Lusitania getting taken out and about all of those American lives. And Germany does kind of restrain itself in the future. They don't want to get the U.S. involved on the war against them. But they reckon, as the war carries on and as they do continue unrestricted submarine warfare, they reckon that they're going to get the U.S. kind of mad. Something's going to happen again. Maybe it's on purpose, maybe it's not. So they reach out to Mexico with the Zimmermann telegram. Zimmermann was the German ambassador to Mexico, and he got a telegram from the Germans, and he brought it to the Mexicans, where he said, if Mexico joins the Central Powers and attacks the U.S. After the war is over, Mexico will get back all of the territories it lost in the Mexican-American War of 1848. So think Texas, most other, like New Mexico, Oklahoma, everything and anything that the U.S. took from Mexico 70, 80 years ago, they're going to get back. Now the Germans know that Mexico isn't quite able to stand up to the U.S., and we'd actually been fighting a quasi-war with Mexico for many years at this point. But the Germans figured it'll buy them a couple of months before American troops come pouring over to mainland Europe. However, there is one hitch in this Zimmermann note, well, two actually. First of all, Mexico is not that stupid. They don't go for it. They don't take the bait. And second of all, the British intercept this telegram, and they show it to the U.S. like a kid who got a good grade on their test, and they're showing their parents. Because when you know it, the U.S. looks at this, and the public gets pretty mad again. A lot of people think that the Lusitania was kind of that spilling point for the U.S. to get involved in the war, but instead it was in fact the Zimmermann telegram. The U.S. public cries and cries for war, and President Wilson, who had spent his whole presidency campaigning on keeping the U.S. out of a European war, now has his hand forced. And so the U.S. is going to send men to Europe to fight and die alongside them because the Germans really just had to poke the bear one too many times. We're going to talk about two men from the Erie area who have served in this conflict, both with the Navy. First of all is William Morrison. Now, he was born right here in Erie in 1869, and he attended the Peekskill Military Academy, and by the time of 1914, he is appointed the commander of the USS Wolverine, which is the same vessel as the USS Michigan, which Gridley served on at a point, in 1914, while Steve was in the Naval Reserves. Fun fact, he was the Wolverine's last commander before the ship, after a long career, was finally decommissioned. So he finds himself called to active duty when the U.S. enters the First World War, and he serves aboard the USS Utah. The Utah spends most of the war on convoy duty, basically protecting supply ships and troop transports that are bound for Europe from the German U-boat threat, which is one of the major reasons why the U.S. got in the war in the first place. After the First World War, Morrison returns to his civilian life here in Erie. He gets elected as one of our state representatives. He pushes for the preservation of Presque Isle as a state park, and after he is successful in that, he actually becomes Presque Isle State Park's first superintendent. So not only does he have quite an accomplished military career, but he is responsible for the lovely, lovely beaches that we enjoy in the peninsula today. Now, William Morrison, obviously, a man like this is going to have a lot of friends, make a lot of friends, and one of his closer friends was that of Frank Bailey. Now, Bailey was not born in Erie. He was born in Buffalo in 1874. He joins the New York Naval Militia and is commissioned with them as an ensign in 1909. Now, like Morrison, he's called up in World War I to serve aboard the USS Nebraska, which, like the Utah, was also primarily responsible for convoy patrolling, anti-U-boat activities, making sure that those troop transports and those supplies containing thousands and thousands of U.S. troops arrived to Europe safely. He did later serve on a couple of troop transport ships after the Nebraska, still during the First World War. And in 1920, he returns to the U.S. Naval Reserves, remaining with the reserves until 1938. So he's freshly retired still by the time the U.S. is pulled into the Second World War. But he's a bit too old to hop on a boat, sink some German U-boats or Japanese U-boats. So instead, he is assigned to work in Erie as the naval advisor to the War Production Board for the region, basically seeing what the Erie region can produce and how that can help the Navy. And following the end of World War II, I suppose he liked Erie so much that he decided to stay. And he moved to the city with his daughter and his very young grandson, who was in fact Thomas Hagen. Seeing as now we've kind of crossed into World War II with the personal story of Frank Bailey, I might as well backtrace a little bit and expand on that by first talking about the Philippines campaign, but beyond that, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. As little known, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't just Pearl Harbor. They also decided to hit the Philippines at the same time, as well as Guam, Wake Island, and several British and Dutch possessions, notably Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. So the U.S. has good 130,000 troops on the islands, both American and Filipino. However, they are not quite ready for what's coming to them. The U.S. has, by this point, started a large-scale production of war-making machines. However, this was done because of the U.S. Lend-Lease Act, so a lot of this stuff had been going to Britain, or they'd been keeping it on the mainland to train up more troops. Philippine campaign does not go well for the U.S. Our forces are mostly pushed back onto the Bataan and Corregidor peninsulas, Douglas MacArthur is ordered to Australia, where he vows that the U.S. will return to the Philippines. He will return to the Philippines. In April 1942, that 130,000 strong force has been shaved down to a good 100,000 men, low on ammunition, food, supplies. I read in one memoir from a cavalry officer on the Philippines that they even killed their horses for meat. So it comes as no surprise to anyone from the West that the starving and low on supplies men at Bataan and Corregidor surrendered to the Japanese. The Japanese, however, are kind of confused by this, because despite the fact that we really had nothing left to fight with, the Japanese logic is, well, you're still alive. So, as 100,000 of our men, American and Filipino, fall into Japanese hands, a lot of them are led through the infamous Bataan Death March. The Japanese they did not treat their prisoners well on this death. It's called the Death March for a reason. If you fell behind on this march, you'd be killed. Stopped to drink out of a puddle, you'd be killed. There's one time I heard about where a Japanese soldier even offered his water bottle to a couple of U.S. troops. They were either beaten or killed for taking it. So, the Japanese did not treat their prisoners very well at all. I don't think they've ever heard of the Geneva Convention based off of the way they treated our men. So, there was one Erieite, well, there's probably more than one, but there was one Erieite of whom I'd like to speak about who was on the Philippines during these dark, dangerous times, and that man being Charles Welcher. He was born in Erie in 1909. In 1932, he graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy and was commissioned as an officer. So that means by the time that we enter hostilities, he'd been in the Navy for close to 10 years, and by this point, he'd found himself stationed on the Philippines in charge of a mobile dry dock named the USS Dewey. If you remember, we spoke about him a little bit ago when we last visited the Philippines. Now, he did manage to scuttle his dry dock before the Japanese could capture it intact. However, the Japanese captured him mostly intact. And so he was held as a POW in the Philippines for years. Presumably, he was used as a slave laborer like the other 100,000 prisoners taken on the Philippine Islands. But in 1944, Douglas MacArthur fulfills his promise. He returns to the Philippines, and boy, does he return with a vengeance. However, the Japanese aren't going to let the U.S. get the last laugh, I suppose you could say. They take POWs such as Charles, and they start loading them up on ships to get them out of there. Charles finds himself on the, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, Yoriyoko Maru, which is a transport ship, which was heading for Japan. Now, Allied POWs had a nickname for these vessels that they would be transported on. They called them hell ships. And I think it's pretty evident why they would be called that. These POWs would be locked in dark, cramped rooms without a lot of food or water and would suffer regular abuses by the guards. Somehow, I find it more important than their abusive treatment is the fact that the Japanese did not mark these ships as POW transports. And so, the U.S. will not quite be blamed when one of our submarines spots the ship bound for Japan with who knows what on board and decides to send a couple of torpedoes its way. And so, Yoriyoko sinks. Now, Charles survives the sinking of his hell ship. However, he is quite badly wounded when he's taken aboard the Brazil Maru, and whilst on board the Brazil Maru, still bound for Japan, he dies of his wounds. The date given is January 16th, 1945. He spent nearly 4 years in captivity. He never saw home again, nor did his daughter see him return home. And there she is right up there. Interestingly enough, because the only information about his death comes from the Japanese, an enemy state at the time, there's no neutral verification or allied verification, say from the Red Cross or any other sort of organization, the US Navy still lists him as missing in action. And so Charles finds himself amongst the 700-odd men and women from Erie who did not return home after this war. However, our war does not begin and end with the Philippines campaign. We have another war going on in Europe against the Germans and Italians because following suit with the Japanese declaration of war, the Germans and Italians decided to throw their lot in and declare war on us too. Seeing how we supplied the British, that was probably inevitable anyways. The first US actions in the European theater of war, to include Africa, is Operation Torch, our entry to the North African campaign. So, if Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and a lot of other US and European possessions, what is the US doing fighting French troops in Africa when the war is over there? Well, as I just mentioned, Germany and Italy declared war on us back, and so we had an agreement with the British that we would help them take care of the Germans first before we really went back into the Japanese. But the US is pretty keen on going to France, which at this point had been more or less fully occupied by the Germans with the help of a Vichy French government that was very, 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 very friendly to the Germans. But looking at what would have been going on by this point in the war, the US is losing a lot of ground in the Pacific, and we're not really doing a lot in Europe. We're just sending boys over to Britain to wait for this inevitable, mysterious invasion. So Churchill, he's trying to prod Roosevelt and the American general, saying, hey, you're going to help us fight the Germans? Stalin, at the same time, is putting pressure on both Churchill and Roosevelt to do more in Western Europe because he's doing all the fighting against the Germans. Thanks for the weapons, guys, but can you also use your weapons to fight them? Stalin probably said in a much more impolite way. So, the British are fighting the Germans in Africa at this point. Montgomery's 8th Army is fighting the infamous Africa Corps led by General Rommel. And there's a bunch of Italians with Rommel as well, let's not forget about them. So, it seems only logical to everybody that the US should kind of help mop up in Africa, help clean up the mess. And as much as Roosevelt and a lot of US generals really don't want to waste time down here, the public, which has a big part in everything it would seem, is also wondering, why are we not doing anything in Europe? So, the US finally concedes. We'll go help out in North Africa, but afterwards, we're heading for France. So that leads to Operation Torch, where the US first get involved in the European theater. US and British troops land in Algeria, French Morocco, and these colonies are not controlled by Germans or Italians. They're still administered by French troops that are friendly to the Vichy government. One less thing for the Germans and Italians to do. However, after a few brief scuffles here and there between the US and British and French troops, the Vichy French in the area decide, well, it looks like the tides have turned back again, and so the man in charge of all of these Vichy French forces in Africa is actually the Vice President or Vice Prime Minister, Admiral Francois Darlan. He gives the order for French troops to stand down and start supporting the Allies. Now, General Mark Clark, who was later famous for leading US forces in Italy, he's the one who set up this deal with Darlan. He referred to it in his memoirs as a deal with the devil. Now, seeing as this is a world of Hitlers and Stalins and Mussolinis, I would call Darlan more like a lesser demon, but I see his point. Problem kind of takes care of itself, however, as a disgruntled Frenchman assassinates Darlan before he could really make any political moves against free French forces like de Gaulle. And so command of all these former Vichy French troops passes to General Henri Giraud. We'll speak about him in a minute again. He comes back. Long story short, US, British, and French troops landing along Morocco and Algeria, they gradually push into Tunisia, where the British 8th Army, fighting more in like Egypt and Libya, also push up. They meet up, surround the Germans in Tunisia, and the battle essentially ends with a good 100,000 plus Germans and Italians laying down their arms, unable to escape to Europe. Now, one thing that surprised me, even years into studying World War II and history, is the fact that this event is kind of not seen as, it's a big deal, but it's not seen for what it truly was. The German defeat at Tunisia is essentially a second Stalingrad level loss for the Germans. For those of you who don't know, Germany lost hundreds of thousands of men trying to capture that Soviet city. The Soviets just wouldn't let them have it. And in the end, about a good 100,000 Germans are taken prisoner, starving in a week. So, between those losses and North Africa also falling with around the same number of Axis troops getting taken prisoner, Germany's having a bad year. But their loss at Tunisia is overshadowed by their loss at Stalingrad. However, they both mark the turning points, if you ask me. Now, there was an Erieite who was involved quite heavily in the North African campaign, his name being Philip Cochrane. He was a colonel in the U.S. Army Air Forces. He was born right here in Erie on January 29th, 1910. And afterwards, he graduated from Ohio State University in 1935. And it's at that point that he does join the USAAF. He said that it seemed, quote, like an easy way to make a living. I suppose it was easy for the first 6 years because, of course, he's still serving by the time the U.S. is dragged into World War II. And so he's put in command of the 33rd Fighter Group in North Africa. And now he often clashed with his superiors who he felt, quote, got in his way. Now, I spoke recently about General Henri Giraud of the French Army. Giraud was one of those generals that you could say they got in Philip Cochrane's way, because his 33rd Fighter Group was providing air support to these French forces. And this had earned Cochrane Giraud's criticism. Giraud said to him at one meeting after these events had taken place, he dreamed of that. You should have hundreds of planes in the air. You're sending so few planes up to support my guys. But Cochrane, he said, probably not in a polite way, well, I can send up as many planes as we have, but your infantry have to do the actual fighting on the ground. That's not my job, that's your job. So this meeting between the two ends, these men part ways. Now, an American colonel getting into an argument, getting mouthy with a French general, it's not just I suppose, disrespect to the chain of command, but because that's a foreign general, it can cause a small international incident. However, the thing is, you don't really want to mess with somebody from Erie. We like to win our arguments. And Cochrane did just that. As a few days after meeting with Giraud, he apparently received a personal apology letter from the man saying, "You're right. I mean, we are the ground forces, you're the air forces," which should be obvious to him. And a few days after that, Cochrane receives the French Croix de Guerre, the Cross of War, for his support of French forces. That, which we know for a fact that he did receive that medal. That to me is enough proof that he was right in the end and Giraud was wrong. So, whilst he was in North Africa, Cochrane also shot down 2 German aircraft. And while that doesn't make him a fighter ace by any level, at this point in the war, most of the German Air Force is having dogfights with the Soviets in the Eastern Front. And there's a lot of pilots who went on so many missions who didn't even get to shoot down one. Seeing as the US and UK Air Forces had German planes outnumbered at least a dozen to 1, being able to take down 2 German aircraft this late in the war is still kind of a remarkable feat. Cochrane is sent home after North Africa, where he is responsible for training the 99th Fighter Group. Now, they're better known to the public as the, I may butcher this as well, as the Tuskegee Airmen, the All-African-American Fighter Group. He is responsible for helping to train them. After his return to the United States, he is sent out once again, this time to command the 1st U.S. Army Air Force Commando Group, which is supporting British operations in Burma. The British, like the U.S., had taken kind of a beating in the Pacific area of war thanks to Japan's all-out attack. They lost most of their possessions and were clinging on to pieces of Burma, and the Japanese were also trying to conquer India from them. Cochrane was part of U.S. Air Forces that were sent in to give the British some support. Now, Cochrane didn't just provide a lot of physical support to the men in Burma. He and his flyboys up there provided a lot of moral support as well. Their presence up there did wonders for British morale, as he found inventive ways to not just provide them air support, but to drop them supplies. He would have gliders get sent in, laden full of goodies, and on top of that, he had the men on the ground, British, Indians, Gurkhas, he had them stuff their gliders full of wounded men, and his planes would kind of make a return run, snag the gliders up, get those men out of there. A lot of this fighting was in the jungle, so if you got wounded and you couldn't really move, it could be a death sentence for you still. One that would be quite more difficult to, one that was a lot longer to get to. Now, the British commander of all British forces in the Pacific, Lord Louis Mountbatten, he personally sang Cochrane his praises, and side note, Mountbatten is actually, he was related to the royal family. He said of Philip Cochrane, "My boy, you are the only bright spot I've had on this front this year in the war." And so Cochrane received the British Distinguished Service Order for his help in Burma. The DSO is equivalent-ish to a Silver Star. Besides this, Cochrane was awarded with the Army Distinguished Service Medal, and photos I've seen of him show him wearing the ribbons for a Silver Star, Soldier's Medal, Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Air Medal as well. I find the award of the Distinguished Service Medal from the U.S. to be unusual in the sense that typically generals were the ones presented with this award, and with the recent invention of the Legion of Merit, you might find a colonel more likely to receive that instead. So, Cochrane receiving an award, and this is the photo of him getting it from Eisenhower, by the way. A photo of him receiving that award. It just shows how effective he was in both North Africa and Burma. After the war, he returned to Erie, he retired, and he started working for his brother's transportation company, Lions Transportation Lines, and later was on their board. He also was very supportive of Gannon University financially, so I personally have to thank him for that as one of their alumni. So, you may notice that this photo that looks kind of like these two photos up here of Philip Cochrane is a cartoon. Cochrane, at some point during the early parts of the war, was noticed by the United States government, and his face was plastered on all sorts of war bonds campaign posters across Erie. We have a few of them up on display in the museum. Now that kind of led him to being noticed by comic strip artists, and so he was the inspiration for a character named Flip Corkin. You can kind of see the vague similarities to Philip Cochrane in the name in the Terry and the Pirates comic strip. And he also served as the inspiration for a character called General Erie in another comic strip that was called Steve Canyon. Now, Philip Erie. With this man's incredible service in mind, I need to return to the Pacific. We're going to be talking about a particular vessel called the USS Wasp. Now, the Wasp was an aircraft carrier commissioned by us in 1940, and it was the only carrier of its class to be made. It was a one-of-a-kind ship, and that's because a few years prior to 1940, the U.S. had signed a naval treaty that limited the amount of tonnage you can have in your Navy. Like, instead of limiting how many ships you have, it limited the total tonnage of all of your ships. And so the U.S. had a little bit of tonnage left over as per this treaty, and they used that to build this aircraft carrier. That was kind of the only real parameters. Build this thing, but it has to be within this weight limit. The USS Wasp was involved in the Atlantic campaign from 1941 to 42. Notably, they had first helped garrison Iceland. Long story there. But long story short, in 1940, with the Germans invading Denmark and Norway and France and the lower countries and everybody, they were afraid that Iceland was either going to fall to the Germans in an invasion or their government would sign on with the Germans. So some British Royal Marines landed in Iceland and put a stop to that. And since the U.S. was neutral, but we wanted to help Britain out, we said, hey, look, we'll free up your Marines. We'll garrison Iceland for you. And so initially, the USS Wasp was part of that garrison force. And when the U.S. entered the war, the Wasp, delivered British fighters to the island of Malta, which was being hit quite heavily by the German and Italian air forces. It was a little safe zone in the middle of essentially Axis-controlled waters, and the Wasp ended up delivering vital fighter planes to the island. But with the War in the Pacific raging at the same time, with carriers being just a bit more important over there, as the Japanese had aircraft carriers of their own, the USS Wasp was moved to the Pacific to replace carrier losses in the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. We may have broken Japan's nose, but they still gave our carrier force a bit of our own black eye. So the Wasp is sent over, and they, for the most part, support the Guadalcanal campaign, the beginning of the U.S. island-hopping campaign, where a Japanese submarine notices the Wasp and decides, I don't like that big old aircraft carrier being there, and they lob a few torpedoes at the Wasp and damage it quite heavily. Now, the Wasp didn't sink right away. Instead, it was scuttled the following night, which means we intentionally sunk it to keep it from their prying hands, but we didn't quite find the ship salvageable. Now, the Japanese torpedo attack did still cause 175 casualties among the ship's officers and men. However, one of the survivors of the attack on the Wasp, well, not only am I going to talk about him in this presentation, but if you will all kindly look at the row of photos there, at the bottom row, second from the left, we're going to be talking about that man, Vice Admiral Thomas Welcher. Now, you might notice that we've already talked about a Welcher today. That is because he is the younger brother of Charles Welcher, who, at this point, still in the war, when the Wasp is being attacked, he's still being held as slave labor on the Philippines. Thomas was born in Erie, like his brother, in 1917, and again, following his brother's footsteps, he attended and graduated the U.S. Naval Academy. However, his story with World War II does not quite start there, because he graduated shortly before the U.S. entry into hostilities, and he didn't quite have good enough eyesight for the Navy to offer him a commission. So he said, screw you, U.S. Navy, and he initially joined the Merchant Marines. And he was, of course, in the Merchant Marines, still part of the U.S. Navy Reserves. So when the U.S. does enter World War I suppose you can say they apologized by calling him up to active duty. Now, we've already talked about the Wasp and what happened to it. He was aboard the Wasp and survived its subsequent sinking, and went on to serve on a couple of other U.S. vessels before war's end. He stayed in the service, and he went to Korea for the Korean conflict, as it's called. Not a real war, I mean, supposedly. And shortly after the war, he became the personal aide to Admiral Arleigh Burke. which I suppose kind of starts his fast track into being the highest ranked admiral to come out of Erie, which makes him a little bit cooler than all those other guys on the wall, I suppose, except I might have to talk more about them on a later date. He became quite involved in the Vietnam War. He was initially in charge of naval support activity through Da Nang. He was also in charge of a lot of brief incursion missions that were going on in Vietnam. But after Vietnam, he becomes the head of the logistics branch, working right under the Joint Chiefs of Staff until he retires in 1975. He retired as a vice admiral again. That makes him Erie's highest ranked officer to serve. And following his retirement, he taught at the U.S. Naval Academy for many years until his death. Now, throughout his career, he earned 2 Naval Distinguished Service Medals, which is the 3rd highest ranked award offered by the United States Armed Forces, for the Navy anyways. He also got 4 Legions of Merit and a Navy Commendation Medal. Thomas passed away fairly recently in 2017, I believe at the age of 99, which in itself is quite a remarkable feat. But here we have one admiral from Erie who served throughout the majority of our conflicts of the past century. So we've jumped a bit into the future with Thomas's career, but now we're going to come right back to the aftermath of the North African campaign, which is Operation Avalanche, the Allied invasion of Italy. Now I'm going to ask you all to bear with me here. I wrote a 90-page paper on the entire Italian campaign about a year ago. But as a reminder, for context, the U.S. is still really want to go to France. They don't care about Italy. They didn't really care about the North African campaign. They want to go to France. They want to hit Germany where it hurts. Yet, they cannot deny that with the heavy losses suffered by the Axis at Tunisia, that they don't have a lot of momentum, and they got to use it. So they take over the island of Sicily. Now this shakes up the Italian high command quite a bit after they lost so many troops in Africa, and now the Allies are kind of knocking at the door. Following Sicily's takeover, the British 8th Army under Montgomery crosses right at the heel of Italy, starts very slowly working its way up. That's not enough. Italy is a country that is almost entirely surrounded by water on 3 sides. It's like one big old peninsula. So there is to be another landing, one at the Salerno beaches called Operation Avalanche. Now, the forces undertaking this operation are the 5th Army under General Mark Clark. You have a U.S. 7th Corps and the British 10th Corps under him as part of his army. They land right about there at Salerno, right outside of Naples, which is up there a little bit. The landings don't quite go as expected. For Italy, after the invasion of Sicily, they saw the writing on the wall, but they could read it. Mussolini was leading them into a slaughter. He had led them into a slaughter, and he had to go. But he had to go in a way that did not make the Germans mad. So, the Fascist Grand Council under Mussolini ousts him with the king's blessing. Oh, by the way, Mussolini while he was in charge of just about everything, he was still kind of under a king who did hold the absolute authority. So when the king and Mussolini's Grand Council oust him, they can't just put in some democratic leader, someone like that. They have to put in another fascist, and so they pick Field Marshal Pietro Badoglio. He's still quite a notable fascist, but being as he'd been in the Italian armed forces long before Mussolini's takeover, he was loyal to the king as well. He would do. And he would do just enough to make the Germans not quite question the Italians. The next step, the Italians enter talks with the U.S. and British. Now, the U.S. and British were actually quite mistrustful of these talks because Badoglio is still a huge fascist. They're reassuring the Germans that they're not doing anything, and so the Allies don't quite know what to make of Italy's sudden will to defect. However, they do come to an armistice agreement that will not be made public until the day the invasion starts, which is September 8th, 9th, night of the 8th, morning of the 9th. And that kind of fouls up some things. The government does not tell the army that there is an agreement with the Allies and to not be ready to switch sides or do any of that. So, on the same day, on the same morning, the armistice is made public to the Italian people. And the Germans had kind of smelled a rat for a while now. So they had a contingency plan to deal with Italy, Operation Axis, which involves the Germans who were already sending troops into Italy to help prepare for an expected invasion. They basically started rounding up Italians, taking them as POWs. Now, initially, the Allies believed that at Salerno, the Italians were going to be garrisoning that part of the coast, but with Operation Axis, there were Germans. They got a rougher landing than expected, and they struggled to hold their beachheads and even connect the US and British beaches. And a massive German counterattack on September 13th also goes ahead and messes up that plan. However, the Allies hold. Montgomery finally reaches the beachheads, and together they push on and liberate Naples on October 1st. That is more or less the first stage of the Italian campaign. However, there's one man from Erie who I'd like to speak about who was involved in the Salerno landings, that being Private First Class Mac Delusti. So Mac was born on December 8th, 1904, making him a bit older than your usual World War II enlistee. Before the war had begun, he worked as a printer, and he found himself enlisting on April 8th, 1942, just a few months into hostilities. Possibly due to his age, he not being so fit as a fighting man, he instead was made a longshoreman, essentially a port laborer, with the 685th Port Company, which was, in the grand scheme of things, attached to Mark Clark's Fifth Army. Now, with the 685th, he participated in the Salerno landings. They didn't just need guys on the beaches, they needed stuff, and so they needed people to get that stuff from the boats to the beaches. Now, he was wounded on September 13th, presumably thanks to that pesky German counterattack, for which he received a Purple Heart. This is actually the exact medal he received during the war. He remained in the Italian campaign throughout the rest of the war. Once the Allies liberated Naples, his port company set up shop there, and he is credited as being part of the Rome-Arno campaign, essentially our liberation of Rome. Now, his service altogether does not seem quite impressive, but amongst his personal possessions, I found some statistics, actually, from his commanding officer, which credits the 685th Port Company and all the other supporting logistical groups with unloading the same amount of tonnage to Naples in 6 months as Naples had gotten in the entire year of 1939. Somewhere in the range of like 2 million odd tons of supplies. And while pre-war Naples had cranes and heavy equipment to help unload these ships, the port companies in Naples did not, because the Germans had wrecked all of that stuff, which makes that feat quite as remarkable. And I include folks like Mac in this campaign because without his service, the fighting men that I'm also talking about would not have the supplies to fight and die on the battlefields to lead to a, hopefully, greater world. So, with this, the U.S. finally reaches France. They've been begging and pushing for this for years, and it finally happens with Operation Overlord and the Normandy campaign. I mean, if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, you probably know generally how this goes down. U.S. and British paratroopers land in France. They're scattered all over the place, so they can't really do their original objectives, but they still make plenty of trouble for the Germans, whilst a large landing force of U.S., British, and Canadian troops hit the shores on June 6th at Omaha, Utah, Sword, Juneau, and Gold. Following this, the U.S. and our allies are kind of stuck in the Normandy area for quite some time, until eventually breaking out with Operation Cobra, allowing us to kind of run amok further inland into France. Besides the liberation of Paris on August 25th, which correlates with this event up here by just a few days, a large force of Germans, I think about 100,000 in total at one point or another, are trapped in this, around the area of Falaise. It's called the Falaise Gap, before we could completely encircle them. Then the area is redubbed Falaise Pocket, in which the Germans lose another 50,000 men inside the pocket. Now that's the bulk of their remaining forces. So in most places in France, the Germans push out, except for the occasional holdout here or there. We're going to talk about a couple of different men from Erie who were involved in the Normandy campaign. First of all being Lieutenant Donald Davie. Davie was born on July 1st, 1920. Remember that date. And he had been commissioned as a second lieutenant, but later promoted to first lieutenant in October 1942, following his training. And he landed in France with his division on July 1st, 1944. He got to celebrate his 24th birthday by joining the front. And that must have been exciting for him. Now, he was with the 90th Infantry Division as they went to bypass some German defenses on the Seves River. They were heading for the small town of Pierres when he was wounded in action by shrapnel from an artillery round. Now, according to a newspaper article written about this harrowing experience for him, the man next to him, he never stood up again. He never breathed again. The man next to him had been killed by the blast, but Donald had taken a wound right here, kind of in the gut by the artillery. And as he was being hoisted on a stretcher, one of the men helping him on said, "Looks like you've got $1 million wound." $1 million because he did not lose a limb, he did not get his face disfigured, but the wound was bad enough where he probably wasn't going to be sent to Europe to fight in the war ever again. He spent months recovering from his injuries in England, then was returned home, where he spent a little bit more time recovering, eventually just serving stateside for the remainder of the war, being discharged sometime in June. For his service in France, brief as it was, he received a Bronze Star, his Purple Heart, and the Army Good Conduct Medal. Following the war, he used the GI Bill to study at Ghent University. So again, my alma mater, I gotta applaud him on his choice of universities. And Donald lived quite a long life, dying only in 2015 in January. His daughter, who gave me all this information about his service, she does credit his death, she does attribute it to the wounds he sustained in France, because she said that he had some medical problems kind of right around here. He would always have fluids drained, and he got so old where the doctors kind of said, "Hey, look, if we drain this from you, we're going to kill you." But I imagine the reason they needed to drain stuff out of him every so often was because the Germans kind of mangled him up a little bit. We're going to talk about one more man from the Normandy campaign, that being Sergeant Jesse Salajac. He was born in 1924 right here in Erie, PA, and he graduated from Academy High School, my favorite high school because it's the one that I more or less graduated from in 2020. Shortly after his graduation at 19, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and was assigned to the 116th Infantry Regiment, which was then part of the 29th Infantry Division, one of the divisions that hit Omaha Beach. So, as you can see, he participated all the way through the Normandy campaign, fought all the way through France, kind of reached the outskirts of Germany. Now, due to events we will get into, the U.S. government couldn't quite verify his death, and so we have here a couple of telegrams that were sent to his mother The first one lists him as missing. They couldn't quite account for him. And the second one from March 1945 officially declares him as killed in action. For his service, Jesse was awarded a Bronze Star and Purple Heart alongside campaign medals. For me personally, the story of Jesse Salajak really does kind of bring the war home. These are all just stories until you find something in common with these guys. Him and I went to the same exact high school. We sat in the same classrooms. We ate in the same cafeteria, same gym, and hell, for all I know, we probably even used the same textbooks. Stories like this really do kind of bring the war home, especially when you can kind of relate to some of these people. Enough about that, however. The Germans aren't quite done yet. They would not give us time to mourn Jesse Salajak and the others. Instead, they had a plan. Mostly Adolf Hitler had a plan, but the Germans had a plan to get the Western European powers in America out of the war for good. They were going to take all of their reserves, the last bits of might the Germans had here and there, and they were going to drive to the port of Antwerp in the Netherlands, the major US and British supply port. Once they took that back, they were going to ask the Americans and British to just come to the table with them so they could call a big timeout, and the Germans could fight with all of their strength against the Soviets. Now this map down here, this like pinkish red bit, that is kind of where the Germans wanted to reach by the time their operation is done. Now this yellow line, and that's about as far as they got. So they did not do quite a good enough job. In the early days though, they did catch US forces off guard. They struck through the Ardennes, which despite attacking through the Ardennes several times in recent history, no one quite thought they would do it again. And so the Ardennes sector had a lot of new units in the US and a lot of tired ones. But despite being initially caught off guard, we would dig our feet in and we would tell those Germans, no, you are done. So one such man who was involved in the Ardennes offensive is Sam Piso, born May 19, 1922, right here in Erie. Whilst he was drafted in the US Army in June, he had tried to enlist in the Marines earlier that year. Now, they didn't take him because he had a bit of an underbite, and because the war just started, the Marines were still a little picky. The Army also initially didn't want him, and so he said, fine, you'll just have to come and draft me instead. And that's exactly what happened. However, and this sentence may confuse a lot of you, by the time of the Normandy campaign, he finds himself landing on Omaha Beach with the 101st Airborne on June 7th. Now that all sounds like I don't know what I'm talking about, but hear me out. There were a couple of elements of the paratroop division that weren't quite meant for jumping. They were more the desk workers and stuff. And these guys, well, they needed help from their fellow US infantry divisions. They combed through and they were looking for artists to help build scale models for the parachute invasions. Sam Piso fancied himself quite a bit of a drawer, and so they plucked him from his unit, had him help build these scale models, but because they were so important, he was not allowed to return to his division after the work was done. So instead he finds himself laying on Omaha Beach the day after the beaches are taken, and once there, he's basically told, okay, you can wait for the rest of your division now. And so he spends a month hanging out on Omaha Beach until the rest of the 28th Infantry Division show up. So the 28th Infantry, they are the US division that is drawn out from the PA National Guard. So it's a whole bunch of people from PA initially, and then they get replaced out by anyone from anywhere. But they partake in the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest in Germany. The Germans put up quite a stiff defense, punched our poor PA boys right in the mouth, but we were moved to the Ardennes sector for a bit of rest and refit when the Germans decided to swing again. And so Sam Pizzo finds himself at the front, right as the Germans are crossing out the Ardennes forests. And the whole 28th Division is kind of battered, beaten. They're losing touch of everybody everywhere. And so it kind of falls down to small groups and small squads to really hold the line. Sam Pizzo, being a sergeant with a headquarters company, being in charge of one of those squads, he heard reports that some German tanks were approaching his position. And so, reckoning that can't be allowed to happen, he grabbed a bunch of grenades and a bazooka, which he had apparently not fired since his basic training, and went to have a look for himself. He found several German tanks, and he had two choices in front of him. He could either get about as close as he could to really effectively take these tanks out, or he can kind of hang back and he might survive the encounter. Seconds to spare, he decided to hang back. He fired off his bazooka, missed, fired it again, and he hit the lead vehicle. He claimed that he took out Tigers, but it was quite possibly other heavy German tanks like the Panther. There's no way to really verify his claims. However, he still took out one big German tank, fired off several more bazooka rounds, managed to disable the second vehicle in line. And at that point, the German infantry helping these tanks out had spotted him. And so he just started running, throwing grenades behind him as he went. Until he linked up with more men from his unit, one of which who had a radio. So they called him the coordinates of that second German tank he disabled. And they managed to get an American artillery gun to fire so many shells in that position, the gun's barrel actually warped. So suffice to say, Sam Pizzo took out two German tanks. His war doesn't end there. Him and his men are on their way back to their headquarters position, where they see the Germans are also heading in that same way. So in a split-second decision, Sam dashes inside his HQ, where he finds everything just the way that it had been left. Classified documents just sitting about. Thinking very quickly, he scoops up everything he can, and he burns the documents, right as the Germans kick down the door and see him doing this. He hops out of a nearby window as bullets ring around him, and runs for his dear life back to his comrades in arms. A bit into their trek away from the Germans, they get captured, and are kind of put in a... Him and his men are captured. They're brought to another large group of POWs, about 125 men in total, but there's only 4 German guards. And so Sam turns to his captain, Captain Nastasi, I believe his name was, and he says, I'm going to make a run for it. There's 4 guards and there's so many of us, they won't, if only a couple of us go, they won't pursue us. And so he runs, and he successfully invades his German captors. Him and his captain make it to Bastogne before the 101st Airborne Division reaches the city to hold it from the Germans, and also before the Germans arrive in force. Because the troops at Bastogne are so low on just about everything, they put Sam inside of a tank as its commander, despite him not being a tanker. And his captain is put in charge of an artillery battery. His captain was not an artilleryman. So when his captain drives up to Sam in a jeep and says, hey, I think we fought enough of this war. Let's go to Paris. Sam shrugs, he agrees, and he hops in the jeep. They don't make it to Paris. What they did do was technically desertion, but they don't make it that far. They go to another town outside of Belgium, which his division had passed through somewhat recently, and the civilians there were kind enough to give them a nice meal and feed them, and then they realized the severity of what they were doing and that they might be shot for it. And so they turned back, reached the 28th Division's remnants, and appeared to the 28th to be just a couple of other stragglers coming in who were quickly and equally folded back in. After the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans had written off the 28th as destroyed, but because the division was put back together piecemeal between these stragglers and replacements, the 28th Infantry spent the remainder of the war reminding the Germans that no, you did not destroy the division. And Sam Pizzo was on the front, fighting the Germans through to Germany for the remainder of the war. Close to the end of the European War on, I believe it was March 17th, Sam Pizzo was billeting a few soldiers who weren't from his unit in his area. Now, it's still winter in Europe, it's still cold. Maybe not to an Erie, but cold to somebody from anywhere else in the world. And so, in one of these ramshackle little wooden huts that they had to sleep in, a little fire was lit. And, well, the little wooden hut caught on fire. San Piso rushed in, grabbed as many people as he could out of there, only stopping when his own lungs were so filled with smoke he just couldn't do it anymore. So he earned the Soldier's Medal for that just a couple weeks later, also receiving the Silver Star for his actions during the Ardennes Offensive. And he lived quite a long, full life, but dying only on January 16, 2003. Now, the Ardennes Offensive, there was one infamous event that stuck with the American public for years and years after the war, that being the Malmedy Massacre. So, to explain this, we have to go back to the beginning of the Ardennes Offensive. Several vanguard German units, like Kampfgruppe Piper, are rushing in with their tanks, trying to outrun the Americans as fast as they can. Now, Kampfgruppe Piper encounters the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. And after a very brief firefight, these artillerymen give themselves up. But Piper, he doesn't have time for prisoners. Are you kidding? So he orders all of these POWs into a nearby field, and he tells his men to mow them down, to machine gun them. And after the men had been machine gunned, the Germans were quite thorough enough to kick a body here and there. If it groaned, shoot it or bayonet it. And they went through and they kicked and they shot anything that moved that they could find. However, they weren't quite thorough. A few men survived this harrowing experience, spread the word of this atrocity throughout the Allied ranks. And so for the rest of the war in Europe, the American troops would scream, "Remember Malmedy." The US also did commit several retaliatory atrocities against SS troops. I've heard from several people after Malmedy, we did not take another SS man prisoner. But if anyone is going to survive such a harrowing experience, it might as well be an Erieite. So let me introduce you all to Kenneth Ahrens. Born in 1923, right here in Erie, PA, and a graduate of East High School, he was drafted and assigned to the 285th, where he was then indeed present for the Malmedy Massacre. He survived the machine gunning with a bullet in his back, but as the Germans went and looked for survivors, he managed to evade this. He feigns death, and he does make it back to U.S. territory, saving another man who wrote him a very long and kind thank you note many years later. And Ahrens is among the survivors of the Malmedy Massacre who testify to what happened there during the Nuremberg trials. And there he is at Nuremberg. He is right now demonstrating for the court that yes, the Germans did make us raise our hands, which implies captivity. And then yes, they ordered us to march into that field. And then yes, the hole in my back shows that they shot at all of us after that fact. Ahrens was awarded a Bronze Star and Purple Heart for his service and survival of this harrowing experience. And shortly afterwards, he works at GE, and then eventually moves to Louisville sometime in the 1950s. He only passed away on October 12, 2004, nearly 60 years after surviving this harrowing experience at Malmedy. I like to believe that once getting lucky enough to survive the German machine gunning, only an Erieite could survive the snow with a bullet in their back long enough to wait for the Germans to go away. So that brings us roughly to the end of World War II. If you didn't know how it ended, I think the writing on the wall from German failures and Japanese failures should spell it out. But we won, and the end result is the United Nations replaces the League of Nations as an international governing body of sorts. And the first test of this UN comes with the Korean War. So, let's backtrack a little bit. The US and the Soviet Union have to share occupation of Korea. Before the war, Korea had been a Japanese colony, and by the war's end, the Soviets had actually invaded Japanese territories in Manchuria and making it as far as Korea. And the Soviets already there, and with Cold War tensions already starting to brew, it's kind of hard to tell them, no, you have to leave. So the country split at the 38th parallel, North Communist, South Democratic, and eventually North Korean troops crossed this parallel in force armed by the Soviets in 1950. The US and UN respond in kind, sending troops to South Korea. And I won't get into too much detail here, but after going up and down the peninsula, eventually the whole war settles in a stalemate after China got involved. And the armistice leaves us with Korea's modern borders along the 38th parallel. However, U.S. policy during the Cold War was to contain communism rather than extinguish it. So you could argue that the U.S. policies of containment were successful. Another Cold War conflict the U.S. was involved in was the Vietnam War. And I know I'm running short on time, and it was already going to be difficult enough for me to summarize 20 years of the country's history in one slide, but just know that after gaining independence from the French, Vietnam was split up in a similar way to Korea, and after some possibly manufactured northern aggression by the U.S., we start to deploy there in force from 1965 to 74. Prior to 1965, we had the occasional advisor helping out the Vietnamese. The U.S. withdrew in 1974, seeing the writing on the wall, and South Vietnam, it did not last much longer, collapsing in 1975, bringing an end to this horrible, horrible conflict. There is a Erie veteran who was involved in both conflicts, her name being Bobbi Hovis. She was born in 1925 in Edinburgh, so a little bit out of Erie, but we've made so many exceptions throughout this presentation. Now, she graduated from nursing school in 1946 and immediately enlists in the U.S. Navy as what is called a flight nurse. So a flight nurse, well, actually their job is quite cool, I would say, to not use professional language. If you have your military nurses, and they do what they can to help the sick and the injured, but if you need to transport these sick and injured men on a plane, well, the treatment can't stop for however long that flight's going to be. So what they did was they trained nurses to, not as pilots, but to essentially act as air crew, so they could continue to administer aid to these men on these flights. You see in this photo, Bobbi actually wears wings for this. Now in Korea, Bobbi served the 1453rd Medical Air Evac Squadron. Throughout the duration of the war, they evacuated over 16,000 injured and sick people without sustaining a single casualty throughout the entire war. Now that alone is an impressive feat, but Bobbi is still in the U.S. Navy by the time tensions begin to brew in Vietnam. And so she is sent, prior to the massive U.S. intervention in '65, she's sent in 1963 to go to Saigon and set up a small hospital for any U.S. advisors that that come under fire, get sick or injured, etc. Now, during her stint in Vietnam, it's said that Bobbi witnessed at least four coup attempts, during one of which a few bullets just narrowly missed her, and she kept one as a souvenir throughout the duration of her life. Now, during her service, she was also exposed to a U.S. chemical called Agent Orange, and she suffered numbness in her legs from it for the rest of her life, unfortunately. She remained in Saigon with her hospital through to 1964, but returned to the U.S. shortly after that, and I think possibly because of her exposure to Agent Orange, her career was cut kind of short, and she left as a lieutenant commander in 1967. She passed away quite recently, actually, just about a little over a year ago on May 5th, 2024. After quite a long and remarkable life, saving lives in both Korea and Vietnam. So this brings us to the last couple of slides. I know I've gone over time. And this is it, I promise. Iraq and Iran had a war throughout the 1980s. Now Iraq won. And actually, the U.S. was supporting Iraq during this conflict because at the time we liked Saddam a bit more than we liked the Iranians. But Iraq also borrowed a lot of money from some of its neighbors, most notably Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And Iraq was really suffering the effects of its debt a few years into these repayments. And so Saddam tries to just have these debts canceled. He reasons that, hey, look, if we didn't stop Iran, you all would have been next. So how about you cut us some slack? Their Middle Eastern neighbors say, no, we can't do that, sorry, try again next time. So Saddam, well, I guess he tries again next time. He accuses Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates of breaking OPEC quotas. It was a Middle Eastern, it's still in effect. It's a Middle Eastern organization that regulates the sale of oil to Western countries. So if Kuwait and UAE are supposedly breaking these quotas and they're selling more to the West, that's essentially robbing Iraq of money it could use to repay them. They also accuse Kuwait of stealing oil from some oil fields that are along their shared border. In the end, the U.S. does try to intervene diplomatically, but Saddam's had enough of it. He sends 100,000 troops to Kuwait, and the country is overrun within a matter of hours. The world at large condemns this. The Cold War is all but over. The Iron Curtain has fallen. No one's there to help Iraq just for the simplicity of, well, you don't really like the U.S., so we'll help you. So the U.S. begins an air campaign in January 1991, targeting Iraqi military and infrastructure targets all around Iraq. There's also a highway of death between Iraq and Baghdad that is hit quite heavily. I encourage you all to look up pictures of that on your own if you dare. Now, the ground campaign begins a month later, February 1991. Now, the air campaign had been going on for a good month by this point. On the ground, the Iraqis only lasted about 4 days. And so a ceasefire follows quickly after, which allows the UN to inspect Iraq's chemical and nuclear weapon capabilities, because there were fears during the Gulf War that Iraq would use chemical weapons. And of course, Iraq is simply saddled with more debt, most of which they have to pay back to Kuwait as reparations. There was one such man from Erie who helped plan out the Gulf War. His name was John Boyd. He was born in 1927 here in Erie. He's not one of the exceptions we have to make. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces right out of high school in 1944, serving as a mechanic. After the war, he goes to college, joins the ROTC, and that's when he receives a commission as an officer. He flies 22 missions in the Korean War, though he doesn't see combat. Do not mistake that for a lack of talent. He, after the Korean War, attended the Fighter Weapons School and was later asked to instruct there. While at Fighter Weapons School, he received a nickname, 42nd Boyd. He challenged anyone that if they could do a mock dogfight, he challenged anyone to a mock dogfight, he would start at a position of disadvantage. If he could not gain the advantage in this fight after 40 seconds, he'd pay his opponent $40. Now, seeing as that became a nickname of his, I don't think a lot of people were able to earn that $40 off of him. He also developed the OODA loop concept. I have written down exactly what that was. It was the observe, orient, decide, and act concept, essentially for split-second decision-making whilst in the air. But a lot of civil businesses have also taken to using the OODA loop concept. Now, all that on its own would make him remarkable. He also helped design the Energy Maneuverability, EM model. That is a mathematical equation that helps regulate behaviors of aircraft in the sky, their maneuverability, all sorts of mathematical things that I cannot understand because I instead read old books. But just know that the use of this EM model influenced the designs of the F-15, the F-16, the A-10, and the F-A-18 aircraft. So you could say that John Boyd helped design these aircraft. A lot of them are still in service today, if not with the US, with other countries. Now, he retired in 1975, shortly after the Vietnam War ends, and he went to Florida to enjoy his retirement. He had his health had started to decline a bit. Warmer weather might help, but he gets a knock on the door. 1990, 1991, he's pulled out of retirement to help plan Operation Desert Storm. He is credited with helping plan like the left hook maneuvers that we did during the brief 4-day ground war. And here's a photo of him after the Gulf War ended, testifying before Congress his reflections of the conflict, what he felt the U.S. Armed Forces needed to change, what they did good, what they did wrong. Boyd dies just a few years later in 1997. That essentially covers all of the pre-modern conflicts that the United States finds itself in. Apparently, I've heard that there are now war reenactments for the Gulf War, and since it was over 30 years ago, it's not quite a modern conflict. In conclusion, as you can see from all the information I presented here, Erie has been quite vital to the U.S. defense. Men like Gridley being at the head of Manila Bay, all the way to people like John Boyd helping to plan our backhand of Iraq in 1991. And of course, this presentation does not include all of the men and women of Erie who continue to serve in modern U.S. campaigns and operations, or ones that have recently started to wrap up, such as the Global War on Terror, which is still kind of ongoing, but it's mostly died down. I encourage you all to visit the Hidden History Center to learn more. Now, years before I undertook this project, I was at a 250 PA conference, an organization that's helping to get the state ready for our country's 250th anniversary. I met a lot of fine people like Governor Ridge, a lot of people from the state and local governments. I forget the gentleman's name, but I was speaking to a gentleman who worked with the state government, and he asked me what I wanted to do with history. And I said, well, to some capacity, I'm going to teach it. And he said, at whatever level you're at, wherever you go, teacher, museum, professor, whatever, always include local history. It's quite important. It is very important. And I didn't understand what he meant. I thought, sure, I'll find if I go somewhere else, I'll find their Battle of Lake Erie and their Straub, Vincent, and I'll talk people's ear off about that. But I didn't quite understand what he meant until I undertook this project. I started looking at not just the surface level vital events of our city's military history, but when you look beyond that, you start to find that your hometown is connected to global events in such major ways. And with that, I would like to thank you all once again for attending this presentation today, for listening to me ramble on for way too much time. However, there's always time for questions. If anybody has any, I would be happy to answer them to the best of my ability.
Roman, I have a question.
Yes.
During your research, what struck you as the most profound, or who did you identify with the most out of all the veterans that you highlighted during your presentation?
My honest answer is Sergeant Jesse Salajak. He went to the same high school as I did. A lot of these people have grown up in Erie, lived their whole lives in Erie. This kind of goes to a level beyond that. You really kind of reflect on what you have in common with these people. And then I kind of realized he was not older than 20 when his life was snuffed out, and so he never had a chance to do the things that I've had to do. Even though I'm still only I'm barely scratching out my mid-20s now. He didn't have a chance to go out and enjoy his 20s or have any sort of life afterwards. And so his story kind of moved me for that, because, his story kind of ends after he graduates high school and goes off to Europe. I graduated high school, and I've been privileged to go into college and to go to grad school, and it's because of guys like him, guys who went to the same high school as you, guys who could have had a normal life like you. I was so moved that I actually inquired with my high school if they had his name up in the building somewhere. They didn't. There's a monument right across the street to all the World War II Korean Vietnam guys from Erie who didn't come back. He's on there, but my school never took us there once. So I suppose in a sense, by including him in this presentation too, I get to pay my respects, and I get to do a little bit to right or wrong like that. Any more questions? Last chance. Yes, ma'am?
I don't really have a question, but I'm in the middle of reading a book, it's a fiction book, about when the Germans went to occupy France. And they went, it's about a particular family, but they occupied this city. They went into people's houses and took over their house, and they hoarded food, and they did all this. It's a fiction book, but it's very, very good. But when you mention about the Germans going into France, they did a very painful thing, taking over France.
Sometimes the best those people could do was just make it another day. Sometimes that's all bravery was. And while that book may be fictitious, a lot of those are based on historical facts. So I don't discount fiction.
Well, it's very true, because the name of the book is Nightingale, and it's about the character, a female, that when the pilots get shot down, she takes them across the mountain and over to an embassy and to save them so they can get back up and fly again.
Wow.
So it's a very good book.
Thank you. Anybody else? Going once, going twice? All right, well, that's the end of the show. That's all.